Shadows of surrender. The war had ended, but for thousands of young German women, it did not feel like victory or liberation. Across Europe, church bells rang, flags waved, and exhausted soldiers embraced. But in the shadows of broken railway yards stood another kind of army. Secretaries, typists, nurses, and radio operators of the fallen Reich. Their uniforms were faded and torn, their faces hollow from sleepless nights and endless retreat. Some were barely 20 years old, yet their eyes had seen the death of a nation. When the orders came to surrender, they expected the worst. For years, German propaganda had filled their ears with warnings that the Americans were beasts, that they would humiliate and destroy anyone wearing the Reich's uniform. Many believed that women like them, those who had served the regime even in small ways, would be made examples of. So when Allied guards herded them into the same boxcars that once carried troops to the front, the air was thick with dread. As the trains rumbled westward, they passed through landscapes that no longer resembled a homeland. Burned villages, bombed bridges, skeletal factories. Smoke still rose from the ruins. The women huddled together on wooden floors, clutching small suitcases and rosaries, whispering fears into the dark. One girl from Hamburg muttered that the Americans would not spare them. Another simply stared at her cracked boots in silence, bracing for what she believed was inevitable degradation. Among them was Anna, a secretary from Munich, who scribbled quietly into a small diary she had hidden inside her coat. "We are being taken far," she wrote. "None knows where. My mother will think I am dead. Perhaps I will be." Her words carried the hopeless resignation that had settled over them all, the sense that their lives were now in the hands of strangers who had every reason to hate them. The journey seemed endless. By day, the light through the cracks in the wooden walls revealed faces smudged with soot. By night, they heard the distant echo of gunfire and the crunch of boots on gravel. Each station brought a new rumor. Some said they were being sent to Siberia, others to forced labor camps in France. But no one mentioned America. America was too far, too unreal, a place that existed only in enemy propaganda posters, showing faceless giants crushing Europe beneath their boots. When the trains finally stopped, they found themselves at ports along the northern coast, Bremen, Cherbourg, Le Havre, where American flags fluttered over ships waiting in the harbors. The sight silenced them. The officers gave brisk orders, and the women were lined up, counted, and loaded onto the ships. The process felt mechanical, almost bureaucratic. There was no shouting, no beating, no cruelty, only the quiet precision of paperwork and procedure. And that, somehow, was even more unsettling. As the engines began to rumble and the European coastline faded into the horizon, an eerie silence fell over the deck. The women stood at the railings, staring at the water, the wind tugging at their hair. Behind them lay the ruins of everything they had known. Ahead, a vast unknown ocean. For the first time, the enormity of what had happened began to sink in. They were not going home. They were being taken to the enemy's land. In that moment, Anna wrote again. "The world we knew has vanished. We are ghosts of a country that no longer exists." She closed her diary and watched the waves break against the ship's hull. Around her, the others stood just as still, a silent, displaced army of women caught between the end of one world and the beginning of another. The crossing of the ocean. The ship's steel belly groaned like a living thing as it slipped into the Atlantic swell, and with it the women felt the last threads of Europe tug loose from their hands. Bunks rose in stacked cages, 3 high, in a hold that smelled of salt, diesel, and the faint iron of rust. Seasickness arrived early, quiet at first, then sweeping through the rows like a fever. Someone whispered prayers, someone else retched into a bucket, most simply lay still, refusing to give the ocean the satisfaction of seeing them break. Order defined everything. Roll calls, head counts, lines, a rhythm of movement that felt cold but not cruel. There were no taunts, no revenge, only the clockwork of forms stamped and names ticked off against lists. That too was disorienting. Vengeance would have been easier to understand. This impersonal efficiency felt like being processed through a machine, sorted, tallied, stacked. Then came the mess line. They entered the galley like figures from another century, faces hollowed by rationing and bad winters. On trays slid pale bread that did not crumble into dust, slabs of meat that glistened with fat, and steaming mugs whose scent, coffee, rose like a memory from a life before air raid sirens. Hands hovered, wary. Propaganda had warned of poison, humiliation, the creativity of enemy cruelty, and yet the sailors in white aprons said nothing, only ladled and passed and moved the line along. The first bites were furtive, swallowed like contraband. A girl from Cologne began to cry without sound, her shoulders shaking over a crust of bread. Another ate fast, then slower, as if learning trust one mouthful at a time. Anna, who had hidden a pencil and a small notebook in her hem, made a note she could barely believe. They feed us as they feed themselves. She underlined it twice and shut the page, ashamed of the astonishment in her own words. It felt like betrayal to be grateful. Above, the weather shifted from pewter to slate, the horizon a dull blade where sky met water. Days blurred. The ship's routines, watches, drills, the barked orders of men who had long ago learned that discipline keeps ships afloat, became a kind of metronome. Between them, the women learned the map of the vessel by touch, the ladder rungs that bit cold into palms, the curve of the passageway where the floor tilted underfoot, the hatch that rattled when the bow smacked through a wave. At night, conversation returned. Not of politics, those words were brittle now, but of small things carried across a ruined continent, a tin locket, a ribbon folded into a book, a scrap of a letter that smelled of cellar damp. Someone produced a rosary, its beads clicking softly in the dark. Someone else told a story about snow in 41 so bright it made your eyes ache. In the hush that followed, the engine thudded like a heartbeat you could not escape. They watched the crew too, their casual strength, their easy jokes tossed back and forth like rope. Some gazes were guarded, some indifferent, a few curious. Nothing matched the nightmare they had been taught to expect. That mismatch lodged like a pebble in the mind. The more you walked on it, the sharper it felt. If the enemy was not a monster, what then had the last years meant? One afternoon, the sea flattened to hammered metal, and sunlight struck the water in sheets. Allowed onto the deck in small numbers, the women pressed to the rail. The wind salted their lips, gulls ghosted the wake. For a little while, the war seemed impossibly far away, reduced to the size of the ship behind them. Then a siren tested, short and harmless, and the spell broke. Memory snapped back like a cable under tension. Nights grew warmer as they steamed west. The bunks no longer felt like coffins, they became shelves where sleep finally found them. Skin cleared, color returned to cheeks in a way that felt like treason. Hunger stopped gnawing and began, bewilderingly, to be satisfied. The body recorded truths the mind could not yet admit. When the lookout finally called land, the word moved through the steel like electricity. America. The name itself was a border. On the deck, hats clutched to hair, they crowded the rail again. A line on the horizon lifted into shape. Docks, cranes, buildings stacked like promises. No ruins, no smoke, a skyline unbroken. Anna wrote one last line before they were ordered below for disembarkation. We left a graveyard and arrived at a picture. She paused, then added, I am afraid of what a picture can do to the dead we carry. Land of the enemy. When the ship finally reached the American coast, the women gathered on deck, clinging to the railings as the skyline came into view. What they saw defied every image that had been drilled into them. No craters, no smoke, no ruins. The buildings stood tall and shining, untouched by war. The docks were alive with workers shouting orders, cranes creaking, and gulls wheeling overhead. For the first time since their capture, silence fell among them, not from fear, but from disbelief. America looked impossibly whole. As they were led off the ship, the women braced for hatred. They expected spitting, shouting, humiliation. Instead, they found order. Soldiers moved them along with clipped efficiency, taking names, checking lists, and assigning buses. Some Americans stared, curious but expressionless. Others barely looked at them at all. It wasn't mercy exactly, it was indifference, and that confused them more than open cruelty would have. The buses rumbled inland, carrying them through a countryside that seemed like another planet. The roads were smooth, the fields alive with color, the houses freshly painted and framed by white fences. Children rode bicycles, women carried groceries. No one looked hungry. To those who came from the gray wastelands of Germany's final months, the sight was painful. This is the land of monsters, whispered one girl from Hamburg. Her friend beside her didn't answer. She couldn't. When the buses finally slowed, guard towers appeared on the horizon. Barbed wire, fences, barracks, yet even here something was different. The camp wasn't chaos or brutality. The paths were swept, the buildings freshly painted, and the guards' faces unreadable but calm. Inside the gates, each woman's name was recorded, her possessions catalogued, and her uniform replaced with plain work clothes. There was no shouting, no beating, no insult, only an eerie quiet discipline. Then the order came that froze every heart. Delousing. Panic rippled through the line. They had heard the rumors, the showers that killed, the humiliation that awaited. As they entered the tiled building, steam hissed and pipes clanked, but instead of jeers, They were handed towels and bars of soap, real soap, white, heavy, faintly scented. Hot water poured down, washing away weeks of grime, lice, and fear. The women wept silently beneath the spray, unable to comprehend that the enemy's first act toward them was not vengeance, but cleanliness. That night, lying in clean bunks, their hair damp and skin scrubbed raw, they whispered to one another in the dark. "They gave us soap," one murmured, as though testing the words. Anna, her diary clutched close, wrote the sentence that would haunt her for years. "We were told they would break us. Instead, they let us be human." Soap and silence. The morning after the showers, the camp seemed unreal. Sunlight filtered through the barracks windows, catching on metal bunks and the pale steam still rising from laundry kettles outside. The women awoke slowly, touching their clean hair, their skin smooth for the first time in months. The smell of soap lingered faintly in the air, a smell so ordinary that it felt sacred. For many, the memory of the shower clung stronger than any sermon of the Reich ever had. When the guards ordered them to line up for breakfast, they obeyed silently. They expected this to be the moment when kindness ended, when masks dropped. But the mess hall was just as strange. Long tables, tin trays, and the aroma of food that smelled real. Coffee, potatoes, bread. They shuffled forward hesitantly, each motion watched by soldiers who neither mocked nor smiled. The women had learned to associate food with scarcity, to eat fast or not at all. Now they received full portions, butter melting on soft rolls, stew rich with meat. No one could speak. Some stared at their plates as if afraid to touch them. Anna sat at the edge of the table, hands trembling around her spoon. The first taste sent tears to her eyes. It wasn't only the warmth or the flavor, it was the realization that the people they had been told were monsters were feeding them better than their own government ever had. Around her, other women struggled with the same shock. One whispered, "My brothers starved in the snow, and here they feed us like this." Another muttered, "Maybe it's a trick." But as days passed and the meals continued, bread every morning, stew every evening, the suspicion began to crumble. Routine slowly replaced fear. Each morning, a bell signaled wake up. There were chores, kitchen duty, cleaning, laundry, but nothing brutal. They were issued camp scrip, paper money that could be spent at the canteen. The shelves there were filled with goods so foreign they felt magical. Chocolate, cigarettes, postcards, even lipstick. The first time a girl from Bremen tried the lipstick, she stared at her reflection in disbelief. "I feel human again," she whispered. But not all emotions were gratitude. Shame soon followed. Letters from home, when they came, spoke of hunger and ruin, families surviving in basements, children boiling weeds for soup. Reading those words while sitting in a warm barrack, with full stomachs and soap in their hair, was unbearable. Anna's hand shook as she folded one such letter, the ink blurred by her tears. That night she wrote in her diary, "The Reich gave us ruin. The enemy gives us bread. I do not know which wounds me more." The camp's silence deepened after that, not the silence of fear, but of reflection. They no longer whispered about cruelty. They whispered about contradictions. Every meal, every bar of soap, every neutral word from a guard chipped away at the fortress of lies they had once believed. Some nights, laughter even returned, a soft, tentative sound, like something rediscovered after years underground. Yet beneath that laughter was unease. For these women, the true punishment of captivity was not cruelty, it was dignity. To be treated humanely by those they had been taught to hate was more disorienting than any prison walls. As Anna noted in her diary, hatred is simple, kindness is the harder wound. The weight of kindness. Weeks passed, and with them came a rhythm the women could not have imagined during their capture. Morning roll call, breakfast, assigned duties, laundry, kitchens or light field work, and quiet evenings under the hum of crickets. The days no longer blurred from fear, but from repetition. What had once been captivity now felt like a strange kind of order. And yet, beneath that calm surface, something uneasy began to grow. The Americans were consistent, predictably so. They neither taunted nor tormented, never raised their voices beyond command. Guards spoke with polite detachment, as if managing a routine task. That normalcy was what broke the women most. They had prepared themselves for violence, but not for decency. Each act of civility, every meal served without insult, every gesture free of scorn, was like a mirror held up to everything they had once believed about their enemy. The physical transformation came first. Color returned to their faces, hair regained its shine, the dullness of famine replaced by reluctant health. For women who had lived years on hunger rations, the body's recovery felt almost like betrayal. To grow stronger in the hands of the enemy was a truth none could admit aloud. "The Reich starved us," whispered one, "and the Americans feed us." The others said nothing, but the silence was agreement. The guards noticed too. Some watched the prisoners with curiosity rather than hatred. A few even nodded in passing, a gesture so small it carried enormous weight. One night during roll call, a young guard dropped his flashlight. Anna bent instinctively to pick it up and handed it back. Their fingers brushed. He muttered, "Thank you." The moment lasted a heartbeat, but for days afterward, she could not shake it from her mind. It wasn't romance, it was the shock of being treated as a person, not a symbol. Letters from home only deepened the ache. "We live now in the cellar," one mother wrote. "The house above is gone. We boil weeds for soup." Reading such words in a place where food was plentiful filled them with shame sharper than hunger ever had. Some women pushed their trays away untouched, unable to eat while imagining their families starving among the ruins. Anna wrote that night, "I eat and my stomach thanks me. I sleep and my body grows strong. Yet every kindness cuts me deeper." By autumn, the camp resembled a small town more than a prison. The canteen shelves gleamed with goods. The fields outside stretched green and silent. Even the barbed wire seemed less menacing in the golden light. And yet that peace carried a cruel irony. They were prisoners, but they lived better than many free Germans. The realization settled over them like a fog, thick, persistent, impossible to ignore. At night, when the lights dimmed and the barracks filled with the soft breathing of sleep, Anna lay awake, tracing the cracks in the ceiling with her eyes. She thought of Munich's ruins, of her mother's hands blackened by coal dust, of the Reich's proud promises now buried beneath rubble, and she thought of this strange new world, orderly, abundant, humane. "To be brutalized would have been easier," she wrote. "To be dignified by the enemy is unbearable." Kindness had become its own kind of captivity, gentle, quiet, but inescapable. Between two worlds. As autumn deepened, the camp settled into a quiet rhythm that felt almost domestic. The women worked, ate, and slept beneath the hum of American order. Yet beneath that calm exterior, something heavier began to stir. A conflict not of nations, but of conscience. The women were not beaten, starved, or humiliated. Instead, they were clean, rested, and fed, and that comfort came with a price they had never expected: guilt. Many had long since stopped counting the days. What had begun as captivity now felt suspended between two realities: the ruins of their homeland and the strange normalcy of America. Each morning, they walked to their assignments under a soft southern sun, passing guards who nodded politely or said nothing at all. They folded American uniforms, cooked American food, tended American fields. The work was dull, but safe. For women who had spent nights hiding from air raids, safety itself was an unfamiliar luxury. The contrast with home became unbearable. Letters arrived sporadically, their ink smudged and trembling. Families wrote of cold, hunger, and despair, of children scavenging in ruins, and fathers missing on the Eastern Front. Reading those words while sitting in a warm, well-lit barrack felt like a betrayal. "If only we had your American bread," one letter read. Anna folded it carefully, then pushed away her untouched meal. Around her, others did the same. The shame of abundance weighed more heavily than chains. When the women were taken beyond the fences for work details, the illusion of peace cracked open even wider. The American towns were untouched. Shop windows gleamed with goods, bakeries overflowed with bread, and children chased hoops through spotless streets. For many, the sight was devastating. "The Reich promised us greatness," whispered one. "This is what victory looks like." That evening, the barracks buzzed with hushed talk. Some spoke with wonder, others with bitterness. To a few, America's prosperity felt like proof that everything they had believed had been a lie. To others, it was simply unbearable. Anna wrote in her diary, "We lived in darkness and called it glory. They live in light and call it ordinary." The transformation was no longer just physical, it was internal, moral, and frightening. Hatred was slipping away, not through persuasion or punishment, but through kindness. Each hot shower, each clean uniform, each bar of chocolate chipped away at the certainty they had been raised with. The Reich had built walls of belief. America was dismantling them without firing a shot. And yet that realization brought no peace. It brought only confusion, an ache that settled deep inside the heart. As Anna closed her diary that night, she finally understood that the true war had only just begun, the one between who she had been and who she was becoming. Cracks in the fortress. Winter crept into the camp quietly, carried on the scent of pine and the soft hiss of wind through the fences. Frost laced the ground at dawn, and the barracks grew cold. Yet inside, The women were warmer than they had been in years. They had grown accustomed to the routine, the morning bell, the steaming breakfast, the measured calm of the guards. What should have been punishment had become stability, and that stability was beginning to change them in ways they could no longer deny. Physically, the transformation was undeniable. Hollow cheeks filled out, skin regained color, and laughter, faint, uncertain, began to return. Mirrors, once avoided, now reflected faces that looked alive again. But each glimpse brought guilt. To look healthy while Germany starved felt wrong, like a betrayal painted on the body. "Our faces lie," one woman murmured. "They say we are safe, but home is dying." Anna wrote something similar in her diary. "We are the enemy's prisoners, yet it is they who have given us back our reflection." The Americans noticed too. Some guards joked lightly, calling the women the cleanest prisoners in Georgia. Others kept their distance, uncertain what to make of these quiet captives who worked diligently and rarely caused trouble. A few even showed small kindnesses, a cigarette shared, a brief smile, a thank you muttered in awkward German. Those moments, tiny and human, confused the women most of all. One afternoon, while working in the camp laundry, Anna caught her reflection in the metal drum of a washing machine. The surface was warped, her image bending in its curve, half her old self, half someone new. She thought of Munich, of the endless rubble, of her mother's letter begging for food. Then she thought of this camp, with its order, warmth, and civility. The comparison felt obscene. How could captivity look more merciful than home? When she returned to the barracks that evening, the women were talking quietly. A few had been allowed outside the wire to work in nearby towns, tidying parks, harvesting crops, or cleaning offices. They described streets full of life, shops bursting with goods, and families living without fear. The others listened in silence, the contrast too painful to discuss. Finally, one voice broke through. "We were told they were beasts," a girl said softly. "But maybe the beasts were us." No one argued. That night, Anna couldn't sleep. The barracks were still, the moonlight slicing thin across the floorboards. She opened her diary, but her hand trembled too much to write. Everything she had been taught about duty, about loyalty, about pride, it all seemed to dissolve beneath the steady, unbearable truth of kindness. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "Hatred is a fortress. Kindness breaks its walls." Outside, the frost thickened on the fences, glinting silver in the moonlight. Inside, something far more fragile was breaking. Not bones, not spirits, but certainty. The mirror of America. As winter deepened, the women were sent more often beyond the fences to work. Trucks carried them through American towns that felt like scenes from a vanished world. Clean streets, bright shop windows, and houses lined with Christmas wreaths. Children pointed and stared, not in hatred but in curiosity. Some townsfolk waved, others simply went about their day, unmoved by the presence of former enemies. What struck the prisoners most was the normalcy. America, untouched by war, seemed impossibly alive. One day, Anna and a small group were taken to help in a church hall where local women prepared meals for field workers. The tables overflowed with sandwiches, fruit, and pies. The smell of baked bread filled the air. When an elderly volunteer urged them gently to eat, Anna hesitated. Her hands trembled as she bit into an apple, the first real fruit she had tasted since 1942. The sweetness broke something inside her. Around the table, a few prisoners wept quietly, overwhelmed not by cruelty, but by generosity. Back in the barracks that night, silence hung thick. The women read letters from home describing hunger, ruins, and disease. One wrote of children eating bark from trees. Another begged, "If you have anything, send it." But there was nothing to send. The gulf between their homeland's despair and the comfort of captivity had grown too wide to bridge. Shame clung heavier than chains. Conversations grew darker. Some admitted what none had dared before, that perhaps their nation had lied to them, used them, broken them. "We were taught the Americans were beasts," one whispered, "but maybe the beasts were those who taught us that." No one answered. The silence that followed was an admission in itself. Even the guards sensed the change. They watched their prisoners work and laugh, saw them hum along to the radio songs that floated through camp loudspeakers. A sergeant remarked, "You'd forget they were the enemy, if not for the uniforms." Yet for all the easing tension, an invisible weight lingered. The women's bodies had healed, but their minds now carried a new wound, the awareness that the world outside Germany was not what they had been told. At night, Anna sat by the barrack window, staring at the distant glow of town lights. She thought of her mother boiling weeds for soup, of her father lost in Russia, of the Reich that had promised glory but delivered only ruin. Then she thought of this land, clean, intact, abundant, and felt the cruelest truth of all. The enemy had given her back her humanity. She wrote quietly in her diary, "I have eaten better as a prisoner than as a citizen of the Reich. I have seen mercy where I was taught to see monsters, and I fear that when I return home, I will not know who the enemy truly was." The enemy's gift. By the time the frost began to melt and the first traces of spring brushed the camp's fields, the women had been in America for many months. What had once felt like imprisonment had become something else, a strange, suspended life between shame and safety. The guards were no longer strangers, but familiar figures. The fences still stood, yet they seemed less like barriers and more like boundaries that protected them from the ghosts of Europe. Their bodies had changed beyond recognition. Faces once sunken by war now looked years younger. Hair shone, posture straightened, laughter no longer sounded foreign. The women caught their reflections in the canteen windows and barely knew themselves. That sight brought both wonder and guilt. It was undeniable proof that captivity under the enemy had made them stronger than loyalty to their own nation ever had. The realization carried a quiet, devastating clarity. The Reich had devoured them. America had restored them. The camp routines went on. Work, meals, letters, roll calls. But something deeper had shifted. The guards no longer looked at the prisoners as enemies, and many of the women no longer saw their captors as monsters. Sometimes they exchanged small smiles or short words of English they had picked up. A few guards passed cigarettes through the wire, a gesture more human than political. No one spoke openly of friendship. That word was too dangerous. But the air between them had softened. Anna's diary reflected the change with painful honesty. "It would have been easier to hate," she wrote. "Hatred keeps the world simple. But kindness demands that we see truth. And the truth is that the enemy has fed us, healed us, and let us live. It is a gift that feels heavier than punishment." Letters from home continued to haunt them. The ink carried despair, hunger, disease, the endless work of rebuilding among the ashes. To receive such words while surrounded by abundance was torment. Some women refused to eat. Others tore up their letters in silence. Guilt became their new captivity. How could they explain that they were warm and healthy while their own families starved? One evening, a guard set up a projector in the canteen and played a movie, an American film filled with music, dancing, laughter. At first, the women sat stiffly, unsure whether to watch. Then, as the film went on, some began to smile, others even laughed quietly. It was not rebellion or disrespect, it was recognition. For a brief hour, they were simply young again. After the film ended, Anna stepped outside and looked at the horizon, where the last light still glowed faintly beyond the barbed wire. She wrote later, "They do not conquer us with weapons. They conquer us with decency. It is the enemy's greatest gift, and the one I cannot refuse." In that moment, she understood that the war was truly over. Not when Germany surrendered, but now, when the walls of belief finally cracked, and something far more powerful than victory had taken root: understanding. The return. By early spring, whispers moved through the camp. Repatriation. The word spread like a chill wind. It should have been good news, a promise of freedom, but it brought only dread. Home was no longer a place they could picture clearly. The Germany they remembered had been reduced to rubble, its cities burned and its faith broken. And now, after months of safety and dignity in the land of their enemies, returning felt more like exile than deliverance. On the morning the lists were posted, the barracks filled with uneasy silence. Names were read aloud, one by one. Each word hung heavy, sealing a fate that no one was ready to face. Some wept softly, others stood still, hands clasped, eyes lowered. When Anna heard her name, her heart clenched. She had dreamed for months of home, but now the thought of leaving this place, of stepping back into hunger and ruin, felt unbearable. The final days were spent in quiet reflection. The guards gave them extra rations for the journey, and a few even offered shy goodbyes. "Good luck," one young soldier said awkwardly, not meeting her eyes. Anna smiled faintly, unsure whether to thank him or apologize. She wanted to say something meaningful, but all she managed was, "You were not what they said you were." He nodded once, understanding more than words could convey. On the day of departure, frost still clung to the fences, sparkling in the morning light. The buses lined up at the gates, engines rumbling softly. The women climbed aboard with their small suitcases and their heavy thoughts. No one spoke. Through the windows they saw the camp receding, the guard towers, the barracks, the American flag waving gently in the wind. For all its fences, it had been a place of safety, of strange mercy. As the convoy rolled away, Anna opened her diary one last time. The pencil shook in her hand as she wrote, "I feared arriving more than I feared dying. Now I fear leaving more than I ever feared them. For the enemy's greatest weapon was not their strength, it was their kindness, and it has changed me forever." She closed the book and looked out the window. The landscape unfurled, fields greening under the sun, roads stretching endlessly eastward toward a homeland she no longer recognized. Around her, women stared ahead in silence, each lost in her own reckoning. Behind them lay captivity, before them ruin. But somewhere between the two, something new had been born, a fragile truth that no war could destroy. As the camp disappeared from sight, Anna felt both loss and liberation. She had arrived in America as an enemy, and left as something she could not yet name. Perhaps not free, but no longer blind. And as the bus rumbled toward the port, she whispered to herself the final line she would ever write. "They gave us soap, and with it they washed away more than dirt."